The garden is gone, but the world it stood in is not. Before the flood, the air itself was different. A canopy of vapor wrapped the earth in a soft, even warmth, filtering the harsh radiation of an unshielded sun and creating a climate without storms, without seasons, without the violent extremes that define the world today. Men lived for 900 years under that canopy. Adam, formed from the dust, walked a planet still scarred by the memory of Eden, a garden hidden behind walls of angelic fire, visible perhaps from a distance but unreachable, sealed by cherubim with a sword that turned every way. This is not mythology. This is the reconstructed reality of Genesis chapters 1 through 5, a world so different from our own that imagining it honestly requires setting aside everything we assume about ancient life. No deserts as we know them, no polar ice. A single landmass, a single climate, and human beings who carried genetic vitality so complete that disease and decay operated on a timescale almost incomprehensible to us now. This was the world before the flood, and understanding it is the only way to understand what was lost when the waters came. The biblical timeline of this lost world is not vague. It is precise, genealogical, and mathematically revealing in ways that most readers never stop to calculate. Genesis 5 gives the ages of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah with exact figures. Adam lived 930 years, Seth lived 912, Enoch 905, Kenan 910, Mahalalel 895, Jared 962. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, lived 365 years before he was taken. Methuselah, the longest-lived human in Scripture, reached 969 years. Lamech, the father of Noah, lived 777 years, and Noah himself lived 950. Now line these numbers up against each other. Adam died when Lamech was 56 years old. That means Adam, the first man, the man who walked in Eden, who heard the voice of God in the garden, who watched his son Cain commit the first murder, was alive at the same time as Lamech, the father of Noah, a direct line of living memory, stretched from the garden itself to within a single generation of the flood. Stories did not need to survive centuries of retelling and distortion. They could be passed mouth to ear, face to face, across a chain of perhaps 4 or 5 men who had personally heard them from someone who had personally heard them from Adam. And then there is Methuselah. His name itself in Hebrew carries the weight of warning, a name that scholars have long connected to a root meaning of death and ascending forth, as though his very existence was a countdown. Calculate his death date against the flood chronology in Genesis 7, and the numbers align with startling precision. Died in the same year the flood began. His entire 969-year life functioned as a living clock, ticking down toward a judgment that had been set in motion generations before it arrived. Whether this was deliberate naming by his father Enoch, who, according to extra-biblical tradition, received visions of the future, or simply a pattern visible only in retrospect, the effect is the same. The flood was not sudden. It was the end of a sentence that had been pronounced long before, and the world had nearly 2,000 years of warning embedded in its own genealogy. But Genesis compresses all of this into a single chapter of names and numbers. What happened during those centuries? What filled the gap between the expulsion from Eden and the construction of the ark? For that, we have to turn to the hidden record, the Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees, and fragments recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls. These texts were known to ancient Jewish and early Christian communities. The Book of Enoch is quoted directly in the New Testament in the Epistle of Jude, where the prophet Enoch is named and a portion of his prophecy is cited almost verbatim. Jubilees was treasured at Qumran, the community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, where fragments of it were found in numbers that suggest it was considered essential reading. And the Book of Jasher, referenced by name in Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18, as a historical source that biblical authors themselves consulted, claims to preserve a fuller account of exactly this period. The centuries Genesis summarizes in a genealogy. What these texts describe consistently is a descent, not a single fall, but an ongoing corruption that accelerated across generations. The Book of Enoch describes a group of heavenly beings called the Watchers, 200 of them according to the text, who descended to a mountain and bound themselves by oath to a course of action that would change the world. They took human wives. They fathered children of enormous size and appetite. And, critically, they did not come empty-handed. Enoch describes them teaching forbidden knowledge, the working of metals into weapons, the art of cosmetics and adornment that Enoch links to vanity and seduction, the reading of omens in the stars, and the casting of spells. This is not a story of simple lust. It is a story of a technological and spiritual transfer that humanity was not prepared to receive. Here, the Hebrew text of Genesis 6 offers a word that almost every modern translation flattens into something far smaller than its original weight. The phrase is kol basar, all flesh. In Genesis 6:12, God looks upon the earth and sees that kol basar, all flesh, had corrupted its way upon the earth. Basar means flesh in the most literal biological sense, the physical material of living bodies. Kol means all, without exception. When the text says all flesh had corrupted its way, it is not using a poetic flourish for general human wickedness. It is making a claim about biology itself, about the corruption of living matter at a fundamental level, a claim that the Book of Jasher expands considerably, describing the corruption of animal kinds mixing with one another in ways that violated the created order, an order established in Genesis 1, when God commanded each kind to reproduce after its own kind. What Genesis 6:12 describes in its original language is not a metaphor. It is a report of biological contamination on a planetary scale. Now picture the civilization this corrupted world produced, because it was, by any honest measure, a civilization. Enoch describes the introduction of metalworking, the forging of swords, knives, shields, breastplates, the tools of organized warfare appearing for the first time in human history. He describes the teaching of root cutting, an ancient term for what we might now call pharmacology or herbal medicine, alongside enchantments, suggesting a blending of medical knowledge with occult practice that the text treats as dangerous precisely because of that blending. He describes astrological knowledge, the observation of stars, the calculation of signs, knowledge that in the ancient world conferred enormous social and religious power on whoever possessed it. Combine this with lifespans approaching a millennium, and you have a civilization with the time, the knowledge, and the population density to build extensively. Jewish tradition holds that pre-flood humanity built cities, developed agriculture far beyond subsistence farming, and organized themselves into complex societies under figures the text calls mighty men, men of renown, a phrase in Genesis 6:4 that in Hebrew, Anshe Hashim, literally means men of the name, men whose reputation and fame had spread across the known world. This was not a thin scattering of cave-dwelling humans. For 1656 years, by the chronology Genesis provides from creation to flood, a continuous civilization developed, accumulated knowledge, and grew. And according to the hidden record, a significant portion of what it accumulated came from a source that was never meant to share it. The corruption that followed was not, according to these texts, simply a moral failure in the sense we usually imagine, people becoming greedy, violent, or selfish in ways that every generation in every era has experienced to some degree. The text describes something more specific and more disturbing. The Book of Jasher states plainly that all flesh, humans and animals alike, had corrupted their ways. And the phrase used is corrupted its way upon the earth, language that in context describes a crossing of boundaries between kinds that the created order had established as fixed. The Book of Jubilees adds further detail, describing how the children born of this union between the Watchers and human women grew to enormous size and began to consume not just the produce of human labor, but the humans themselves, and eventually turned on each other and on the animal kingdom in a cascade of violence that the text describes as filling the earth with blood and injustice. What emerges from reading Genesis, Enoch, Jubilees, and Jasher together is not a story about bad behavior spreading through a population, the kind of moral decline that could theoretically be reversed through repentance and reform. It is a story about a fundamental alteration to the biological and genetic fabric of the world, an alteration introduced from outside the natural order that propagated through bloodlines and species lines until, in the language of Genesis 6:12, all flesh had been affected. This is why the response that follows is not a plague, not a war, not a political reckoning. It is a flood, a complete reset of the biological world, sparing only what had specifically set apart and preserved. And the catastrophe itself, when it comes, is described in terms that go far beyond rain. Genesis 7:11 gives the precise mechanism, and it describes two events occurring simultaneously. The text says, "The windows of heaven were opened, and on the same day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up." Two distinct sources acting at the same moment. The opening of the heavens corresponds to the failure of that vapor canopy described earlier, the atmospheric structure that had maintained the pre-flood climate, releasing its moisture in a sustained downpour, unlike anything in recorded history. But the fountains of the great deep describes something else entirely. Vast subterranean reservoirs of water held under pressure beneath the Earth's crust, breaking open from below. Imagine the geological force required for that, the crust of the planet itself splitting along fault lines as pressurized water forced its way upward, reshaping coastlines, raising mountain ranges, and churning the ocean floor into the sediment layers that geologists still study today. Rain falling from above, the Earth's crust failing from below. Two judgments converging on a single point in time. The aftermath reshaped everything. The climate that emerges in Genesis after the flood is a different climate entirely. Seasons appear for the first time, described explicitly in God's covenant with Noah in Genesis 8, where cold and heat, summer and winter are named as a new feature of the post-flood world, implying their absence before. Radiation levels almost certainly increased without the vapor canopy's protection, and the genealogies in Genesis 11 record a dramatic generation by generation collapse in human lifespan from the near millennium, ages of the pre-flood patriarchs, down to lifespans approaching what we consider normal within just a few generations after the flood. The world that emerged from the water was not simply the old world, wet. It was a fundamentally altered planet. Different atmosphere, different climate, different biology, different lifespan. The flood did not just punish the old world. It ended it and replaced it with a new one. And here is where the evidence stops being confined to the Bible and becomes something far larger. Because the flood is not a story unique to Genesis. It appears with startling consistency across civilizations that had no contact with each other during their foundational periods, separated by oceans and continents and thousands of years of independent development. In the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written epic in human history, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by a god of a coming flood, builds a vessel, loads it with his family and with animals, and survives a catastrophic deluge that destroys the rest of humanity. In Hindu tradition, the figure of Manu is warned by a divine being, builds a boat, and survives a flood that submerges the world, after which he becomes the progenitor of a new human race. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and his wife survive a flood sent by Zeus to destroy a corrupt humanity, building a chest or ark on the instructions of his father and afterward repopulating the earth. In Chinese tradition, the figure of Gun and later his son Yu are central to a flood narrative in which Yu spends years controlling the floodwaters and reordering the land, an event treated as a foundational moment in Chinese civilization. These are not the only examples. Researchers cataloging flood traditions across indigenous cultures worldwide have identified more than 200 separate flood narratives, from the Americas to the Pacific Islands to sub-Saharan Africa, cultures with no documented contact with Mesopotamia, with Greece, with India, or with each other during the periods when these stories first took shape. And yet, the same elements recur again and again. A single righteous individual or family, specifically warned in advance while the rest of the population is not. A vessel of some kind, built according to specific instructions. Animals preserved alongside humans. A flood sent as divine judgment for human corruption, and a new beginning, a repopulation of the earth from the survivors. Name these elements one at a time, and each could perhaps be coincidence. A flood story is not surprising on a planet with rivers and coastlines. A hero surviving a disaster is not surprising in any tradition's mythology, but the specific combination, repeating across civilizations separated by oceans, by language families, by thousands of years, with no plausible route of contact during the eras when these stories originated. The statistical probability that this is independent invention, repeated identically more than 200 times, by coincidence, is effectively zero. Something happened, something global, something catastrophic, something that every surviving human population remembered and passed down. Each culture preserving its own version of the same underlying event. What does this lost world tell us about where we come from? It tells us that the world as it exists now, with its seasons, its shortened lifespans, its climate extremes, is not the original condition of the planet. It is the aftermath of a reset, a deliberate and total reordering of a world that had become, in the language of Genesis, corrupted in all flesh. And it tells us something else, something that the New Testament returns to directly. In Matthew 24, Jesus is asked by his disciples about the signs of the end of the age, and his answer points backward before it points forward. He says that as the days of Noah were, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. He describes people eating, drinking, marrying, going about ordinary life, unaware, until the flood came and swept them all away. This is not, on its face, a description of a world full of obvious, visible wickedness that everyone could see and condemn. It is a description of normalcy, in ordinary routines, a population entirely unaware that the pattern beneath the surface of their world had already reached its conclusion. The days of Noah, read against the full picture given by Genesis, Enoch, Jubilees, and Jasher, were not simply a time of moral failure, visible to anyone paying attention. They were a time when something fundamental had already shifted, silently, beneath the surface of apparent normality. And the people living through it had no idea the end had already been set in motion. Whatever Jesus meant by drawing that comparison, he was pointing his listeners back to a world that looked stable, that looked permanent, that looked like it would simply continue, right up until the moment it did not.